The cold was pervasive, biting through the walls of every home in the small town, settling into the bones of its inhabitants. The air itself seemed to freeze in place, thick with the chill of winter and the weight of wartime dread. The streets, once lively with children playing and neighbors gossiping, now stood deserted, save for the occasional figure darting from one dark corner to the next. At every moment, it felt as though the very land was holding its breath, waiting for something, anything, to happen. The horrors of war had seeped into the very fabric of daily life, leaving behind a sense of unease that no amount of time or familiarity could erase. But there was one thing that struck the civilians the hardest: the knock. To those living in the shadows of a war-torn world, the sound of boots on cobblestones was no longer an ordinary noise. It was a signal, a harbinger of something terrible. The relentless drumbeat of marching soldiers was a constant reminder of the occupation they had come to fear. There was no mistaking it. The knock on the door meant the arrival of something unknown, but undeniably dangerous. Whether it was a call for those who had been marked for deportation, a visit from the Gestapo or the local authorities, or the dreaded command to report to an unknown location, the knock was always tied to loss. The town had learned to live with this fear, accepting it as a part of the daily rhythm of their lives. No matter how hard the people tried to ignore it, the knowledge of what might come at any moment seeped into their conversations, into their movements. They could no longer stand in their doorways without glancing nervously down the street, knowing that the next knock might very well be their last. Every day, the civilians carried a heavy burden, one they could neither explain nor escape. The knock wasn't just a noise, it was an event, a moment that fractured the day and left a lingering dread hanging in the air. It would always come in the middle of the night or in the early morning hours, when the moon hung heavy in the sky or the first hints of daylight crept through the darkened streets. It was as though the sound itself was designed to disrupt the calm, to rip apart any illusions of safety that might remain. When it came, the civilians were paralyzed. No one dared move too quickly, for fear of drawing attention. They would freeze, as if holding their breath in unison, waiting for the door to open or not, for the footsteps to fade away or not. There was a strange kind of solidarity in this shared silence, as if they were all engaged in the same desperate prayer. Let it pass. Let the knock pass. The knock was more than just a warning of personal danger. It was a reminder of everything they had lost and could lose again. In the weeks and months since the occupation had begun, families had already been torn apart. Fathers, husbands, and sons had been taken away, some never to return, others to face a fate unknown. The women, the children, the elderly, those left behind, were left to carry the weight of absence, constantly reminded that their time might come next. The knock was an unwelcome reminder that no one was safe, that in a world so twisted by the cruelty of war, there was no guarantee of mercy or protection. The town had become a place where the fear of the knock was etched into the very air, a place where survival was a daily struggle, not just against the elements, but against the ever-present uncertainty of what tomorrow might bring. And yet, in spite of this, the civilians carried on. They did what they had to do to survive. They worked in silence, moved in secrecy, and held their families close. They were becoming experts in the art of quiet endurance. But despite all their efforts to adapt, to bend without breaking, there were some things they could not escape, things they could not outlast. One of those things was the knock. Every family had its own way of coping with the tension. Some tried to ignore it, going about their routines as if everything were normal, if only for a moment, if only for a brief respite from the gnawing anxiety that always hovered just below the surface. Others kept themselves inside at all times, drawing their curtains tight, hiding behind the illusion of safety that only the walls of their homes could offer. Still, others took a more active approach, gathering in secret to discuss the rumors and whispers that circulated like wildfire through the town. They tried to prepare, to anticipate the worst so that they might at least be ready when it came. But none of it was enough to erase the feeling of doom that hung over them all. The knock, the sudden intrusion of boots on their doorstep, would always come. No matter how much they hoped otherwise, no matter how many precautions they took, they knew that one day, it would be their turn. The fear began to affect more than just their actions. It started to seep into their very hearts. People began to lose hope, as if each knock, each doorbell ring, could be their last. The once tight community started to splinter. Some turned inward, clutching to what little they had left, while others looked to the world outside, wondering if there were any hope left beyond the border of their occupied town. It was a helpless feeling, watching the life they once knew, the life they had built with sweat and tears, slowly crumble beneath the weight of occupation and terror. But there was another layer to this fear, one that few dared to speak of out loud. It was not just the fear of losing loved ones or being forced from their homes, it was the fear of the unknown. What would happen if they answered the knock? What would happen if they defied the soldiers who came to take them away? The civilians knew that it was not just the occupying forces they had to contend with. There was the ever-present danger of betrayal, of neighbors turning on neighbors in the face of survival. In such an environment, trust was a rare commodity, and the instinct to protect oneself often outweighed the impulse to protect others. The knock symbolized not just the loss of personal freedom but the very fracturing of the human bonds that once held society together. As the weeks turned into months, the fear of the knock deepened. The townspeople had seen too much, endured too much, to believe that life could ever return to normal. But even as the darkness of war closed in on them, there was a small ember of hope buried deep within, a hope that one day, somehow, this terror would end. And so they waited, each knock louder than the last, each day stretching out into the next, unsure whether the next sound they would hear would be a warning or a death knell. They didn't know how long they could keep going, how long they could continue to live in a world where the knock was always present. But for now, they endured, clinging to the fragile threads of normalcy that remained, knowing that sooner or later, the knock would come for them all. And in that moment, they would either freeze in fear, or they would find a way to face it together. In the midst of the cold and the fear, there was a glimmer of something unexpected, a whisper of hope, almost imperceptible at first, but undeniable once it began to spread. It came not from the expected direction of the government or the occupying forces, but from a group of British soldiers, part of an underground resistance that had quietly made its way into the town. These soldiers, their faces hardened by the brutalities of war, were not the men who had marched in with their boots thundering on cobblestones. They were different. They were silent shadows in the night, moving quietly through the streets, unnoticed by most. Their mission was not one of conquest, but of kindness, an operation cloaked in secrecy, an operation designed to offer what little relief they could to those living under the oppressive weight of occupation. The town, once so accustomed to the sound of boots marching toward them with threats of violence and separation, now began to hear a different kind of step, the soft, careful tread of those who had come not to take, but to give. At first, the civilians weren't sure how to react. They had learned over the course of the war that nothing came without a price, that any action, no matter how seemingly benign, often concealed a darker motive. The British soldiers, too, were no strangers to the distrust that had built up in the hearts of the townspeople. After all, hadn't it been British bombs that had once destroyed their homes and killed their families? Hadn't it been foreign soldiers that had imposed the horrors of occupation on them? The civilians had long ago learned not to trust anyone who appeared on their doorstep, especially those who wore foreign uniforms. So when these new figures appeared in the shadows, carrying packages wrapped in plain cloth, they weren't immediately met with open arms. Instead, there was hesitation, a cautious, skeptical pause as the residents watched the soldiers from behind their windows, their doors tightly closed, their minds filled with doubt. What were they really here for? What was the true purpose of their presence? Were these soldiers simply trying to lull them into a false sense of security before the real invasion began? Or were they part of some larger scheme to catch those who had been involved in resistance activities? After all, the knock of the occupying forces was still fresh in their minds, and the fear of betrayal still hung thick in the air. The people had grown adept at reading the smallest of signs, detecting the smallest movements, always on the lookout for any hint of danger. But this time, something was different. The soldiers did not approach with guns drawn or with demands to be met. They came bearing supplies, blankets, food, medicine. Things the civilians had not seen in months, and certainly not enough to fully relieve their suffering, but enough to spark a flicker of something deeper than suspicion, curiosity. The soldiers didn't ask for anything in return, didn't demand compliance. They simply stood at the door, offering the small bundles with silent gestures of kindness. And then, they would disappear into the night, as quietly as they had arrived. It wasn't long before the townspeople started to question their initial judgments. Slowly, as the days went by, those who had received the unexpected gifts began to speak of them, tentatively at first, almost as though they were afraid to voice their gratitude aloud. But the word spread nonetheless, as it always did in tight-knit communities like this one. The children who had long ago learned to hide their fear and their hunger began to show the blankets to their parents with wide-eyed wonder. "Look, Mama," one child might say, clutching the soft wool in both arms. "It's warm." And for a moment, there was something other than cold in the house, something that couldn't be measured by a thermometer or weighed by the scarcity of resources. The adults, too, began to speak quietly among themselves. The soldiers' presence was still a mystery, but the sight of the blankets, the packages of dried meat, the small jars of jam, brought with them something much more potent than the simple relief of material goods. They brought a strange sense of comfort in the midst of a war that had robbed them of so much. The soldiers, too, had been through hell, had seen the worst of humanity, and yet they had come not with a mission of destruction, but with one of survival. They had not just come to fight, but to share in the struggle for life, for warmth, for hope. As the days went by, more civilians began to take the risk of opening their doors, of accepting the aid that was offered. The fear of betrayal still lingered in their hearts, but it was tempered by a growing sense of something they had not felt in a long time: trust. They were, in a way, forced to face the complexity of their own emotions. On one hand, they could not forget the past, the pain and suffering that had been inflicted upon them by both sides of the conflict. On the other hand, they could not ignore the present moment, where something small, yet significant, was unfolding before their eyes. In a town ravaged by war, where every act of kindness felt like a fleeting dream, the appearance of the soldiers became something more than a gesture of goodwill. It became a symbol of resistance in its own right. The civilians could no longer afford to cling to the idea of a world divided into heroes and villains, oppressors and liberators. The lines had blurred, and the war that had once seemed so black and white now appeared in shades of gray. The soldiers who came to their doors were not faceless enemies. They were men and women who had witnessed the horrors of war, who had been shaped by the same trauma and despair. They were survivors too. And so, with each passing day, the town began to breathe again, albeit in quiet, careful breaths. The soldiers' visits, while still shrouded in secrecy, became a source of hope, however fleeting. What had once been a fearsome presence was now something else entirely. The boots that had once heralded violence and destruction now became a symbol of an unexpected, yet desperately needed aid. And as the civilians began to open their doors more freely, something else shifted within the town: an unspoken understanding, a fragile but growing sense of community. The town's inhabitants had lived through a lifetime of war, had learned to shut themselves off from the world, to trust no one, not even their neighbors. But now they were starting to let down their guards, starting to trust again. There were still questions, so many questions. What would happen when the war ended? Would the soldiers simply leave, their aid and their kindness left behind like so many fleeting moments in the past? Would the people ever truly be free from the shadow of war? But for now, these questions could wait. For now, there was warmth in the blankets, and a brief respite from the relentless cold. For now, there was a chance to believe in something other than survival, something other than fear. The soldiers, for their part, continued their quiet work, moving through the streets at night, their mission ever more urgent with each passing day. They knew they could not stay forever, that the war would eventually claim them or force them to move on. But as long as they were here, they would continue to offer what little they could, to leave behind what remnants of humanity still existed in this fractured world. For they, too, knew that in the darkest of times, even the smallest act of kindness could be a revolution in itself. And so they came, quietly, secretly, bringing with them not just supplies, but a spark of something far more precious than they could ever have known: hope. The first frost of winter had begun to settle, coating the town in a thin veil of ice that seemed to freeze not just the earth, but the air itself. The streets, once bustling with the hurried steps of civilians attempting to carry out their daily routines under the constant shadow of war, were now eerily quiet, save for the occasional creak of wooden shutters or the soft, muffled sound of someone moving cautiously inside their home. The warmth of community that had once defined this place had all but vanished. In its place, a cold, heavy silence had taken root, with every creak of a door and every rustle of fabric within the walls seeming amplified. And yet there was something else now, a deep, unsettling stillness. Something more than the absence of sound. Something almost like a collective exhale, as if the town had been holding its breath for too long and was now unsure what to do with the space left in its wake. The civilians of the town had become accustomed to this quiet. They had learned how to live in it. The fear, the anxiety, had become like an old coat that one had worn for so long that it no longer felt out of place. But with the arrival of the British soldiers and their unexpected aid, something else had begun to stir in the hearts of the people. For the first time in months, they had allowed themselves to feel something other than dread. They had allowed themselves a brief, fleeting respite. The soldiers, who had arrived quietly in the night with blankets, food, and medicine, had offered a form of kindness that was alien in this world of loss. And it was that kindness, small and fragile as it was, that began to unravel the knot of fear that had tightly bound the hearts of the civilians. The soldiers' gifts had not been grand, nor had they been meant to fix the brokenness that hung heavy in the air. But they were enough to stir something, a brief moment of peace, an acknowledgement that perhaps, just perhaps, there was still something worth fighting for beyond mere survival. For the first time in what seemed like forever, the civilians began to relax, just a little. They let their guard down in small, imperceptible ways. They allowed themselves to speak to one another again. They whispered of the blankets, of the small provisions the soldiers had left on their doorsteps, and began to wonder aloud what it all meant. What kind of soldiers would risk their lives to offer aid rather than violence? The question lingered in the streets, and in the back of the minds of every man, woman, and child who had been touched by the soldiers' silent gestures. Slowly, something that had seemed unimaginable just days earlier began to take root: hope. But it was a fragile hope, tempered by the weight of history. The town had seen too much to be easily fooled. They had lived through occupation, loss, and betrayal. They had been taught to trust no one, not even their closest neighbors. So when the soldiers knocked on their doors again, bringing more gifts, the fear crept back in, though now it was a fear mixed with a strange kind of longing. What were the soldiers asking for in return? What would they demand when the time came? The civilians could not help but wonder what strings were attached to the kindness they had received. They had learned over the course of the war that there were always strings, and they knew better than to believe in a kindness that didn't come with a price. And yet, something was different this time. The soldiers did not come with an army. They did not come with a mission to take anything from the people. They simply came with packages wrapped in plain cloth, with no demand, no expectation, no speeches. They just came. And so, for the first time, the people allowed themselves to open their doors fully, to accept the gifts without suspicion, to let down their guard, even if just for a moment. There was a kind of tentative trust that began to blossom in the hearts of the civilians, one that could not be easily extinguished. The blankets were welcomed with open arms, their softness a balm for the weary and broken bodies of those who had been enduring the brutal hardships of war for so long. The food, though meager, was still food, a symbol that they had not been forgotten, that there were still those out there who saw their suffering and chose not to turn away. It was not just the provisions that began to shift the atmosphere in the town, however. It was the soldiers themselves. As they moved through the streets, the air seemed to change. They walked with a purpose, but it wasn't the militaristic, aggressive purpose that the people had come to dread. It was something else, something quieter, something more human. There was a weariness in the soldiers' eyes, a recognition of the brutality that had scarred not just the civilians, but themselves as well. They were not here to impose their will, to claim victory, or to wage more war. They were here to share a moment of humanity in a world where such moments were rare. The civilians began to see them not as conquerors or occupiers, but as people who had lived through the same horrors, who had fought their own battles, who had witnessed the same suffering. They began to realize that the soldiers were not so different from themselves after all. They were simply survivors of the same broken world. It wasn't long before this fragile trust began to shift the dynamics of the town. People who had once eyed their neighbors with suspicion now found themselves talking more openly, more freely. They discussed the soldiers' visits, their shared gratitude, and the strange, uncomfortable joy that came with receiving kindness in the midst of so much suffering. It was a joy tinged with guilt, guilt that they had survived when so many others had not, guilt that they had allowed themselves to feel something other than fear, guilt that they might be betraying the very principles that had once defined them. But in spite of this guilt, there was still that spark, a spark of humanity that could not be extinguished, no matter how hard the world tried. The soldiers' visits continued, becoming more regular, their presence more accepted with each passing day. The town slowly began to thaw, not just from the frost of winter, but from the frost of fear that had frozen its heart for so long. The blankets were a small comfort, yes, but they were also a reminder that even in the darkest of times, there could be moments of grace. And for the civilians, those moments, fleeting as they were, became the thread that held them together. In a town where survival had become the only goal, the soldiers' gifts reminded them that there was more to life than simply enduring the world's cruelty. There was still room for compassion, for solidarity, for the warmth of human connection. But even as the people began to embrace this newfound sense of hope, the soldiers remained a mystery. They would come, they would offer their help, and then they would disappear into the shadows once more. They were not there to stay, and the civilians knew that. Their presence, though comforting, was temporary, and it only served to highlight the reality of the situation. The soldiers were not there to change the course of the war, to end the occupation, or to restore the town to its former glory. They were there to offer a brief reprieve, a moment of quiet in a world that had been ravaged by violence and loss. And when they left, the town would return to its harsh reality, the knock would return, and the weight of survival would once again fall upon the shoulders of those who had been left behind. Yet, despite this fleeting nature of their help, the soldiers' visits had changed something in the town. They had changed the way the civilians saw themselves, and perhaps more importantly, the way they saw each other. The walls that had once separated neighbors, families, and even entire communities had begun to crumble, replaced by something more fragile, but more precious: trust. The soldiers had come not to claim victory, not to conquer or occupy, but to remind the town that even in the midst of war, even when the world seemed consumed by darkness, there was still room for small acts of kindness, for moments of connection. It was a lesson that the civilians would carry with them long after the soldiers had gone, a lesson that would, in time, become the foundation upon which the town would rebuild itself, not from the ashes of war, but from the fragile threads of humanity that had somehow survived its ravages. As the days stretched into weeks, the once cautious relationship between the civilians and the British soldiers deepened into something neither side had fully anticipated. The town, having learned to live in constant vigilance, found itself at a crossroads, no longer just enduring the ever-present threat of war, but beginning to face the strange, uncharted territory of trust, solidarity, and shared humanity. It was a quiet transformation, one that unfolded not with fanfare or grand gestures, but with small, subtle changes in the way people interacted, the way they looked at one another, and the way they began to see the soldiers, not as distant, foreign entities, but as something else entirely. Allies, perhaps? Fellow survivors. It was a connection that was fragile, but real. In the beginning, the civilians had been skeptical, their eyes narrowed with suspicion each time the soldiers appeared at their doors. The knock was still a heavy thing, a reminder that the war was never far away, that safety was always tenuous and fleeting. Yet with every visit, the soldiers began to chip away at that suspicion. The people had no illusions. They knew these were not acts of charity, not simple gifts meant to ease their burden without cost. But they also began to realize that perhaps this was not an exchange built on the usual terms of war. It wasn't about domination, defeat, or occupation. It was something more complicated, and perhaps it was something that had been missing in their lives for far too long. The soldiers, for their part, had not come with grand aspirations of changing the course of the war, nor did they expect to see their names etched in history for their actions. They had come for one simple reason: to make life just a little easier for those living under the crushing weight of the occupation. Their mission was small, modest, even humble in comparison to the vastness of the conflict that surrounded them. And yet, it was in that quiet, unspoken act of solidarity that they found their purpose. Each time they crossed the threshold of a home, they brought not just the physical provisions of blankets, food, and medicine, but something far more intangible: the knowledge that they had not been forgotten, that they, too, were part of the human equation in a world so divided by war. For many of these soldiers, this mission became a form of redemption, a way to balance out the horrors they had witnessed, a way to remind themselves that not every interaction in this world needed to be one of destruction. The interactions between the soldiers and the civilians had changed subtly at first. The initial hesitation had given way to a cautious curiosity. The civilians were no longer simply waiting in fear for the next knock, but looking forward to it with a mixture of hope and uncertainty. They began to understand that, for the first time in a long while, the presence of the soldiers did not signify impending violence. Rather, it signified a possibility, a chance to breathe, to rest, to regain some of what had been lost to them. The soldiers, too, began to change. They had arrived as strangers in a foreign land, with their own burdens, their own pain. But in these quiet, human exchanges, they began to feel something they had not anticipated: a deepening connection to these people, these survivors. They, too, had been victims of the war, had borne witness to its horrors. And in some strange, inexplicable way, helping the people of this town was their way of holding on to whatever scrap of decency remained in a world gone mad. The community began to settle into a rhythm. Every few days, the soldiers would appear at a different house, delivering their meager supplies, offering their help without asking for anything in return. At first, the civilians had wondered whether they were simply biding their time, waiting for the war to end, waiting for the moment when they would be asked to leave, when their presence would no longer be needed. But the soldiers never left. They kept coming over and over again, never demanding anything, never expecting recognition. They simply did what they could, quietly and without fanfare, and then they disappeared back into the night. Over time, the townspeople stopped questioning their motives. They saw the soldiers not as foreign occupiers, but as part of a much larger, shared struggle. They too had suffered. They too were tired. They too had lost loved ones. The line between us and them blurred, and in its place, a deeper, more complex understanding emerged, one based not on political ideologies or nationality or race, but on something far simpler: shared experience. The soldiers, for their part, had not anticipated this connection. They had arrived with a mission, and their expectation was that they would deliver their goods and leave, their involvement with the civilians remaining brief and transactional. But as they spent more time with the people, as they saw the exhaustion and sorrow etched into their faces, they began to question their own assumptions. They had been trained to fight, to conquer, to defend their land. They had been taught to see the enemy as faceless, as the other. But here, in this town, they were encountering a different kind of humanity, a humanity that defied the simple categories of friend and foe. The people here, like them, were simply trying to survive. And in that shared struggle, the soldiers found themselves facing a moral reversal, the realization that the war they had fought in, the war that had separated them from these civilians, was not the only story worth telling. There was another story unfolding in the quiet spaces between the gunfire, a story of resilience, of kindness in the face of overwhelming hardship. It was a story the soldiers had never been taught to recognize, one that could not be captured by the binary lines of victory and defeat. The town itself, for its part, began to evolve in ways the soldiers hadn't anticipated. The people who had once kept to themselves, who had lived in isolation, now began to open their doors not just to the soldiers, but to each other. They began to speak more openly about the things they had lost, about the traumas they had endured. They began to share their stories, not just with the soldiers, but with one another. The fear that had long driven them to hide in silence was gradually replaced by a sense of shared understanding. No one in the town was untouched by the war. No one was without their own scars. But in that shared suffering, in that mutual recognition, something powerful began to emerge. a new sense of community. The war had divided them, but it was also, in its own strange way, bringing them back together. In the evenings, when the soldiers had finished their rounds and the civilians returned to the quiet routine of their lives, there were moments of quiet connection that transcended language, nationality, and the brutality of the world around them. Some of the soldiers began to find small ways to help even beyond the gifts they brought. They would offer to repair broken windows, to chop wood for families who had no one left to help them, to offer advice or assistance in whatever way they could. It was a strange, almost bittersweet role reversal. The soldiers who had once marched into the town as occupiers were now seen by some as protectors, as helpers. For the first time in their lives, some of these soldiers realized what it meant to be in a position where their help was not a form of dominance, but an expression of solidarity. The people, in turn, began to change as well. They had long been taught to distrust those who came from outside their world, to see every stranger as a potential threat. But the soldiers had proven them wrong. Slowly, they began to understand that it wasn't about who wore what uniform or who spoke what language. It was about the people behind those symbols. And it was in these moments, these shared acts of kindness, that the town began to heal in ways that no political change, no military victory, could have accomplished. They were not waiting for a grand victory, not waiting for someone to save them. They were saving themselves, together, one small act of connection at a time. And so the town grew. Not in the way it had once been, full of bustling markets and busy streets, but in a quieter, more deliberate way. It grew in the way people looked at one another, in the way they trusted, in the way they shared. It wasn't much, but it was everything. And in that fragile, fleeting moment, amidst the ashes of war, something miraculous had begun to take root. The knowledge that, even in the darkest of times, the human spirit could still find ways to reach out, to connect, to rebuild. And for the civilians and the soldiers alike, that knowledge became a quiet beacon, guiding them through the night. The air in the town had changed. The previously tense stillness that had hung over it, thick with suspicion and fear, now felt like a fragile truce. A truce born of necessity, of shared struggle, and of those small moments of unexpected kindness between the civilians and the British soldiers. Yet, as with all things fragile, this new peace was tenuous, and the quiet rhythm of life that had slowly begun to emerge now seemed to hang in the balance. While the soldiers had brought comfort and warmth into the lives of those who had suffered so much, the harsh realities of war were never far behind. The knock on the door, once dreaded and filled with terror, still held the power to disrupt their fragile calm. Though the soldiers' presence had softened the edges of their suffering, the civilians knew, deep down, that the war was not over. It had merely taken on a different shape, and they, the survivors of it all, were left to carry the burden of that knowledge. The British soldiers, too, had felt this shift, this quiet weight of something unspoken. They had come to the town not to conquer or control, but to offer relief in small, quiet ways. They had not intended to stay long, not to form any lasting bonds. They had expected their role to be temporary, to fade as quickly as it had appeared. Yet, as the days passed, their mission had changed without their realizing it. What had begun as an operation of aid had turned into something deeper, something that neither the civilians nor the soldiers had anticipated. In the calm moments between deliveries of food and blankets, the soldiers had come to know the people of this town, learned their names, their faces, their stories. In turn, the civilians began to see the soldiers not as enemies, but as men like them, men caught in the same storm of violence, driven by survival rather than domination. They were not the enemy, they were the other side of the same coin, the faces of a war that had left no one unscathed. But that stillness, the fragile peace they had worked so hard to build, was beginning to crack. It had been whispered about in the shadows for days, rumors, half-heard conversations carried by the wind. The occupying forces, those who had once threatened to uproot the town and take its people away, were planning a raid. The town had heard stories of such things before, of villages like theirs being torn apart, families separated, innocents dragged away in the dead of night. The civilians had feared this moment for so long, and now it had arrived. The knock that had once meant the arrival of soldiers bearing blankets and bread now seemed to hold a different kind of menace, a new fear. The knock was no longer just the sound of charity, It was the sound of betrayal, of someone being sold out, of the cracks in the very fabric of their survival.